So the problem with the export-led growth strategy is you're going to still follow an ISI model. Then you are not letting other people's goods in. Good luck trying to export your goods outside. I mean, it has worked. Countries that have been able to practice the export-led growth model would include those East Asian countries like Taiwan or South Korea that were able to export a lot despite being completely closed to outside goods coming in. Now, this is a very unique situation for them because, again, they had a sugar daddy named the United States of America that was prepared to enter into a bad deal with these countries for security reasons because South Korea and Taiwan were meant to keep China in check. But in any way, these are the different kinds of models that countries might consider pursuing when they are periphery, right? One one is what we may call orthodoxy, the normal way that the West preaches to be modernization of free trade. The other might be, go your own path, realize that there might be a dependency and follow one of those three paths here. So those are the two big streams of the way the country can be developed. Okay, understanding that, now I think we are prepared to talk a little bit about Mexico's political economy. If you can remember the reading, Mexico when it had its revolution in the 90s, drafted a constitution in 1917, which was largely a reaction to being trapped on this periphery where there was a lot of foreign direct investment into Mexican businesses, but mainly Mexico was an exporter of raw materials or goods back to the US and back to Europe, which under Porfiriato, if you can remember, that of Porfirio Diaz, resulted in there being a lot of foreign direct investment. Again, not to create manufacturing within Mexico, but at least to start exploiting natural resources that were agricultural or due to natural resources. Now, of course, this all changed in 1917. They said we are going to go our own path. Remember, it was a pretty left wing type of party that was brought in, again, with the goals such as nationalizing businesses and redistributing the land. Remember those kind of goals and not letting foreign companies come in to Mexico and not letting foreigners own property. So Mexico really entered into ISI model um, mm, from 1940s until 1982. They kind of followed that idea. For Mexico, what this looked like was a lot of support for local industrialists. Um, so Mexico started to what have its local businesses started to produce things like refrigerator and certain lot of clothes, and government encouraged this by giving such businesses special tax breaks and giving special access to credits. They need to borrow money, and the government said, "We are the ones will give you that," and also, of course, through protectionism, very high tariff barriers. And when the GATT is what created or which became WTO later, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. Um, After Second World War, Mexico was not part of that. They said, no, we don't want to enter um, into free trade system, which is throughout the world. Again, another thing Mexico had to do because there was not a lot of wealth in Mexico. There weren't a lot of wealthy people in Mexico, and especially there was also especially there also wasn't a lot of foreign direct investment, which would have brought wealth in. Where was the money gone? Going to come from to the industrialize? Well, the government had to supply that money itself, and sometimes it had done so in revolution, seizing property that actually belonged to private individuals who were foreigners by nationalizing those businesses. And hey, you cannot own these businesses anymore, only Mexicans can. So I'm taking away your business from you. This allowed Mexico, the Mexican government, to enter into ownership of things such as steel mills or power plants, ports were national rather than private, and of course, heavy investment into what we call Pemex, the Petroleum Mexicano, which is the nationalized company that exports Mexican oil, its petroleum, and it's owned by the government, Pemex. Another step there was to create this thing called Nacional Financiera, which was simply a bank that provided money to promote industrial development. Again, when I say credit here, this really allowed the Mexican government to choose which industries have thought strategically it want to develop. If you think back to what we talked about Christian Kron, that recommended reading about Christian Kron, and the fact that in the UK, industrialization came through private individuals investing a lot of money. It wasn't the government that was leading this, and wasn't the government that had control of banks. In Mexico, we see a different situation. We see the banks in control of investment, but it's government banks, government institutions such as NAFIN. Uh, and what this did is it produced slow but steady growth, which is one sense, was good. It allowed the government to continue paying its bill and continue some level of development going. But it was very slow, and most of Mexico remained very poor, and certainly with such low level of growth. It wasn't an attractive place for foreigners to invest, partially because they couldn't own an awful lot, but partially because they couldn't make a lot of money in Mexico. They say I can make a lot of money elsewhere if I invest there. So that's the model they had. Let's talk a little bit about how this model came into disrepute, why they don't practice this anymore. Well, one of the problem here, if you practice protectionism and give tax break to your businesses so that they can be more competitive, that means you're not getting any money from them. If you're not taxing them, you're not going to have any revenue. The US may soon find out what this is like by heavily lowering the tax rate for businesses. So much we will see what happens for the government revenue. And again, people say, well, who cares if government has money or not? Well, different people might have um, different people mm, might care more than others, but it will certainly probably had a lot of cuts in social programs that we are going to see in US. Coming back to Mexico, so Mexico had very limited revenue because of the way it allowed its national, some homegrown businesses to do business without being taxed. Moreover, because these businesses were not efficient and not competitive, uh, I didn't have to compete with the global market. They usually didn't really know what they were doing. And this required those businesses to import a lot of technologies, which wasn't being developed in Mexico, but they had to import. And this is very costly. If you want to buy the information of how refrigerator works or how to put together a computer, you are going to pay an awful lot of money. And that just led to, businesses spending most of their money getting the know-how, how to produce what they were doing. Mexico was in the process of uh, redistributing land, but there was a huge problem with that because peasants, farmer were not very competitive. They owned very small tracts of land, and sometimes you have to produce an awful lot. They call those economies of scale. You have to produce a very large level to get first a profit, and the Mexico farmer themselves couldn't borrow more money because they actually didn't even own the land. What happened was the land was redistributed to peasants on a communal basis, something called hajido, where the farmers themselves didn't own the money, but the community owned the money. And they were able to till the land and make a profit out of it. But if they ever wanted to borrow a lot of money, they never had anything. They had no collateral. If you wanted to get a loan, if they wanted to get a tractor or something like that, you got to go to bank. You might you ask for a loan, the bank will say, well, what can you offer in case you don't pay this money back? A Mexican farmer would have had nothing. They would have had no land. It's like the situation of not being able to mortgage. And so what happens was the Mexican government went into debt. Again, we talked about this. There were pretty rampant inflation because of all those protectionism and the propensity of the Mexican government to print a lot of money to make this happen. Its own money wasn't worth very much, and this led to even greater debt. Now, fortunately, at first for Mexico, this did not lead to disaster they started because as they started having problems, the world slowed down economically. The one thing that the world really needed and where the prices had gone up was, of course, oil and the oil crisis. And this actually meant a windfall for the Mexican at first. That the first thing that they were able to produce and export a lot, oil, had suddenly become a lot more expensive. So they were making a lot of more money. This is great. And what Mexico did with that money is partially invested, and partially they started to go more into debt. There were plenty of banks now that said, "Oh, great, oil is the next big thing. You guys have a lot of oil. Why don't you borrow some money now? Why don't you borrow some money?" Now, as we know, PRI always wanted to borrow a lot of money because they could build the kind of infrastructure that would keep loyal to it and voting PRI. So by late 1970s, had these oil prices increase really rescued the economy? No, because like I said, the government rather than paying off its debt immediately said we will live with those debt and we will pay them off later in the long run. But right now, let's spend it on infrastructure. So let's spend it on the kinds of things that will make people happy and keep voting us back into office. Now, this became problematic for two reasons. One of which was that suddenly oil prices went sunk to the low in the 80s, and all of a sudden there one huge commodity was no longer there, and moreover, the US, the huge trading partner for Mexico, went down the path of austerity. Austerity simply means spending less money, and one of the ways we spend less money is we lowered interest rates in our bank. We raise interest rates in our bank, making it more difficult to borrow money. And the Mexicans suddenly couldn't borrow as much money as American banks as they had previously. So credit has dried up, and Mexico was in a situation by 1982 to 1981 or 1981 where they were defaulting, not able to pay those loans.